Morning. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Stephen Joyner. Dr. Joyner is an assistant professor of political science at Carson-Newman. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Milligan University, as well as a master's and PhD in political science from the University of Kentucky. While in graduate school, Dr. Joyner worked with one of his professors to publish an article in the journal Conflict Management and Peace Science on the effects of changes in power on military alliances. At Carson-Newman, Dr. Joyner teaches courses on international relations, comparative politics, U.S. foreign policy, political violence, and American government. Also at Carson-Newman, Dr. Joyner is the faculty advisor for the student group Mortar Board. And next semester, Dr. Joyner is starting a competitive Model United Nations team for Carson-Newman students in history and political science to compete against other schools and universities throughout the South. Please.
When I heard that I would need to give this talk on courage, that I was going to get to give this talk on courage, the first thing that I thought about, was, oh no, I've got to come up with a talk about courage. And then the second thing that I thought about when I actually sat down to do this was I started to think about this old statistic that has been floating around in college speech classes for, the last 50 years or so. And this statistic, some of you may have heard it if you've taken a speech class in college, is that people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. People are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. So, the first time I ever heard this was, we don't have to go into that, how long ago that was. But the first time I heard this, I thought, no way, that can't be true. People are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying? That doesn't make any sense. And then, I got the call to come do this talk, and I was like, yeah, actually, no, this makes a lot of sense, yeah, 100%. Well, it turns out, like any good researcher, you can find out if something is true or not. There are people who have studied this, and they have tried to replicate this finding over the last 50 years. And as it turns out, yeah, it's kind of true. If you ask people what they're scared of, if you ask people what they're afraid of, public speaking shows up over death, over financial problems. Go ahead and hit the next one as well. And the other thing that shows up is snakes, right? It's public speaking and snakes. Those are usually the top two if you ask people to rank what they're scared of. They're scared of being up in front of audiences, and they're scared of snakes. Go ahead. And while I was doing this research, I ran across this fantastic survey from last year that asks Americans whether they think they could beat various wild animals in a fight while they're unarmed, by the way. This is a fight with no weapons, no tools of any kind. Do you think you could one-on-one take one of these animals? Go ahead and hit it one time. Yes. So the first thing that drew my eye was that people said, 15% of Americans said that they could beat a king cobra in a fight. 15%. That's a pretty high number. That tells me that in this room right now, there are some of you, they're probably all right here, who think that they could beat a king cobra in a fight. 15%. Go ahead and hit that one more time. That's what a king cobra looks like. If you were unaware, they're pretty terrifying animals. But, I suppose it's possible, some of you might be able to beat a king cobra in a fight. Well, I guess that does depend on your definition of beating, right? You might be able to kill a cobra, but can you kill a cobra without having the cobra bite you? That's the real question. Because you see, king cobras, their venom can kill you in 15 minutes. One bite, 15 minutes later. So you might be able to kill the cobra, but can you really beat the cobra if you die 15 minutes later? I don't know, maybe we could have that argument. Go ahead and hit it one more time. The other thing I noticed in this survey, which I promise I'm going to talk about courage. I promise, I'm getting there. The other thing I noticed in this survey is that 8% of Americans think they can fight a gorilla. Go ahead and hit it one time. Which tells me that I think 8% of Americans don't know what a gorilla is, right? Because a gorilla, 500 pounds, 6 feet tall, could tear you in half without breaking a sweat. You have no shot against a gorilla. You might be able to kill the cobra. You might even be able to do it without it biting you. you got no chance against a gorilla. If a gorilla wants to kill you, it's going to kill you. They're really good at that. So, yeah, you know, I just stumbled across this, and I thought that was really interesting. Americans have very poor judgment of their own combat prowess. They're just unaware of what they can actually take. So let me get back to talking about courage, which is what I'm here to do. Courage is really interesting to me because courage is difficult to pin down. I know, because I spent a lot of hours trying to pin it down for this talk. It's a difficult thing. There's thousands of pages written about courage. You know, people have been talking about courage for thousands of years, and they've said all kinds of things. And all of that stuff, it's hard to fit that into any neat definition. And as a political scientist, I love me a definition. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Definitions, I think, are critically important to learning, critically important to understanding. If you take any of my classes, maybe outside of LA 101, no, actually we do this in LA 101 too. I can't escape it. If you take any of my classes, you'll know that I spend sometimes half a class, sometimes an entire class period. If you take my comparative politics class, you'll see that I spend an entire week on just defining democracy. Right? I think definitions are critical. I think they're very, very important because we all need to have the same understanding of the thing if we're going to be able to learn about the thing. Right? If we're all thinking about different stuff, it's not going to be as impactful. We're not going to learn as much. Right? And as a researcher, if you don't define something at the beginning, you risk ruining the whole project. So one of these things that I think is really difficult to define is terrorism. This word, terrorism. Go ahead and hit the next slide. You see this word used in all kinds of places. Parents might describe their 2-year-olds as terrorists, right? Some of you are nodding your heads because you have younger siblings. Others of you are confused because you're only child. Yes, children can be terrorists, but also, go ahead and hit it one more time. In the news, you'll hear about terrorists. You'll hear about people like ISIS committing attacks, right? You'll hear about terrorist events happening around the world. And the problem is, when we allow anyone to just use a word to describe anyone that they don't like we do with the word terrorism, governments just use it to describe people they don't like, it becomes a jumbled word. It becomes a word that means nothing because it means everything. And courage can be a little bit like that, right? Courage can be like terrorism in that it's difficult to pin down. So my first thought as far as how to define terrorism, or not terrorism, sorry, how to define courage. I know how to define terrorism. I'm good with that one. As far as how to define courage was to look at what smarter people than me have said about it, right? So go ahead and hit the next slide. Maya Angelou was a poet and civil rights activist in the United States, and she had this to say about courage. Courage is the most important of all the virtues because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. So for Angelou, go ahead and hit the next one. For Angelou, courage is an enabler. It enables other virtues, right? Things like goodness, things like honesty, justice. You can't have these things if you don't have courage. You cannot practice these things consistently if you don't have courage. It's easy, it's possible to have these things some of the time. It's easy to be kind some of the time. It's easy to be good on occasion. But to have courage means that you're able to be good when it's hard to be good, that you're able to be kind when it's hard to be kind. So courage is at least in part an enabler. So we're circling around this thing, courage. We're trying to form some kind of idea of what it is. And the first piece of that idea is that it enables. Go ahead and go on to the next one. So Billy Graham was an American preacher, a very prominent figure in American Christianity over the second half of the 1900s, from late 1940s to the early 2000s. He had this to say about courage. Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are often stiffened. I think he meant that as a compliment. It's not like they're uncomfortable and their spines are stiff, so they're uncomfortable. No, I think he meant this as a compliment, right? The spines of others, they're also able to stand up when they see one person stand up. Yeah, so it's a short clip, right? But a very famous movie and a very famous scene. You'll hear it referenced at various times, including right now. So at the beginning of that scene, right? You see all of these escaped slaves in Rome, chained together. They've been captured. They've made their great escape, but they've ultimately been captured. They're all rounded up. And they know, very likely, they're going to die. And they're not going to die an easy death. They're going to be probably crucified because of what they've done. And then as the commander rolls up there, he says, I will spare all of your lives if you just give me Spartacus. If you give me the slave called Spartacus, I will let all of you live. So, you know, Spartacus, the courageous person that he is, decides he's going to stand up. He's going to give himself up. He's going to identify himself and give himself up so that he can save all these other people. And yet, as he's standing to do that, he's chained to the men next to him. And the man next to him stands up faster than he does. Right? You hadn't seen the movie, so you didn't actually know which one was Spartacus. It was the one who didn't say anything. That was him. Right? So the man next to him stands up and says, I'm Spartacus. And then the man on his other side says, I'm Spartacus. And then they all get up, the whole crowd of them, and start chanting, I'm Spartacus, right? When one person shows courage, it can inspire others to do the same, right? Courage is therefore contagious. Courage is contagious. So we have two things so far. Courage enables, and courage is contagious. Go ahead and move on to the next one. Nelson Mandela was an anti-apartheid activist, and eventually the president of South Africa. And he had this to say about courage. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers fear, right? He who conquers fear. So Nelson Mandela is a very fascinating figure in his own right. He spent nearly 3 decades, almost 28 years, as a political prisoner in South Africa. And I find that when I teach about South Africa, when I teach about apartheid in my classes, my students mostly don't know anything about it, right? Yeah, I see some of you nodding. You have no idea what this is. So go ahead and go to the next one. The system known as apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa. And what apartheid did was the government basically put people into categories, into groups, and they said, you are part of the white group, you are part of the black group, you are part of this other group, right? And the group that the government said you were part of determined a lot about your life, where you were allowed to live, type of jobs that you were allowed to take, whether you were allowed to participate in politics at all. All of that was determined by this category that the government puts you in. Yeah, so the whole system of apartheid involved moving 3.5 million people out of their homes to somewhere else in the country, taking that land.
Might be out of battery here, possibly. So, yeah, I'll just use this one. That's fine. I'll try to stay centered. So yeah, this whole system of apartheid, this is the sort of thing that Nelson Mandela was organizing against, right? He was part of this group called the African National Congress, and the things that he was doing was he was trying to come up with ways to resist apartheid, to organize people against this system, right? And that's ultimately what got him thrown into prison. The South African government arrested him, gave him a show trial essentially, and then threw him in prison for 28 years. All because, not because he was committing crimes, not because he was some heinous criminal, but because he was organizing people to disagree with him, right? He was ultimately what we call a political prisoner. And that's when he wrote that quote. So go ahead and move on to the next one. That's when he wrote this quote, right? That courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. He had a lot to be afraid of, right? He definitely had a lot to be afraid of, but while sitting in prison, right, the government came to him many, many times, asking him, hey, Nelson, we'll let you out. We'll let you out of prison. All you have to do is agree to stop working against us. All you have to do is agree to stop organizing people against apartheid, and we'll let you out. The South African government, you have to understand, and maybe it's hard to understand unless you remember sort of the kinds of things that happened earlier this year when Russia invaded Ukraine, right? You saw people around the world having protests, changing their Instagram photos and all of that. You saw big rallies and things against war. That sort of thing had been happening around the world for 20-something years. People were rallying around Europe. There were protests. There were concerts that said, "Free Mandela," right? He was an international figure. They were under a lot of pressure to release him, but he wouldn't give up his conviction. He wouldn't give up his belief that apartheid was wrong and that he had to work against it, right? So he had to hold on to that, and that's where he learned that about courage. So go on to the next slide, yeah. What Nelson Mandela is saying there is that courage involves fear, right? It enables other virtues. It enables us to have other virtues. It is contagious to people around us, and it is intimately tied to fear. And now maybe it's starting to click into place here, why I started this whole thing talking about what people are afraid of. Because courage, unless we have fear, we cannot experience courage. They are that closely tied together. So fortunately, we've got these, it's almost like a constellation, right? It's almost like a nexus of smart people saying things about courage, but when you hear these people say things about courage, you can almost believe that they're talking about different things, right? They're talking about completely different concepts, but no, they're all talking about courage. So as someone who loves a definition, I'm still in the wind. I still don't know how to define this simple thing. But fortunately, I'm not the only person who had this problem. Researchers at Yale in the early 2000s wanted to do some research on courage, and they ran into this very problem that everyone has their own idea about courage, and there's not one cohesive definition of it. So they tried to examine everything that people have said about courage and sort of distill it down to 4 main components. So go ahead and go to the next one. The first main component is that courage is intentional. Courage is a choice. It is a deliberate choice, right? You cannot be courageous if you are acting blindly. You cannot be courageous if you do not understand a situation, right? Courage requires knowledge. It requires understanding. You have to understand what you are doing and then make a choice to do it, a deliberate, intentional choice, right? It's a choice of those people in that clip to stand up and say, "I'm Spartacus," knowing that that choice might get them killed. It's a choice. It's a choice that Nelson Mandela made to stay in prison, to remain in prison, and not agree to stop resisting apartheid. That's a choice, right? It's a choice to love your neighbor as yourself. That's a choice, right? It's a choice, like Dr. Bryant Chaney talked about last time. It's a choice to get into good trouble, right? That's a choice. Courage is a choice. So go ahead and go to the next one. The second common piece of the definition is that courage involves fear. It involves personal fear, right? If you are not afraid, just like Nelson Mandela was talking about, you can't have courage, because courage involves triumphing over your fear, right? So, we have these two things, right? Courage is making a choice, and it involves fear. So courage is therefore making a deliberate choice in spite of fear, ultimately in spite of fear. Sometimes we have too much fear, right? Fear can be very useful, like when you encounter snakes, right? Your fear says, "Hey, whoa, buddy, that's a snake. That's a snake. Look how weird it moves. It's weird," right? Don't go mess with the snake. And I think if you take nothing else away from today, don't fight snakes is maybe, that's top of the list, right? I want you to know that. But fear can sometimes be a very useful thing. It can let us know when something is dangerous. But to have courage, to act with courage, means to overcome that fear, to look it in the face, to understand why we have it, and then to make a choice to do something anyway. Right? So the third element of courage that those researchers discovered is that courage involves a good and noble act. Right? You cannot be courageous while also being evil. You cannot be courageous if fundamentally what you're trying to do is hurt other people. That doesn't involve courage. Courage is a positive virtue. It is a good virtue, right? So, now we have 3 pieces of this. Like with Dr. Brian Chaney when he talked about good trouble, getting into good trouble. Courage is about making some intentional choice, despite whatever fear you have, and making that choice with goodness in your heart, right? Making that choice for the right reasons, to do something for the right reasons. So that brings me to another question. What on earth are the right reasons? And I think you could go many different ways with this. I think there are many possible answers to this question, but I like the answer that I've chosen. So you can go on to the next slide. I like the answer that I've chosen because in the Bible, Jesus tells us what the right reasons are. It's pretty simple, right? In John 15:12, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Right? That's it. Love one another. That's the right reason, right? Sacrifice yourselves to help one another. Got to think about, what is Jesus saying? Right? What is Jesus saying? Love one another as I have loved you. Well, how has Jesus loved us? Right? He sacrifices himself for us. That's what we're supposed to do for other people. That's the good reasons to be courageous. Courage is not selfish, just like love is not selfish. Courage and love both come out of a deep desire to help other people, right? To help the planet. Courage is not something that you have to have for yourself. It's something you have to have for others. So the final component of courage identified by those researchers is that courage involves risk. Not just any kind of risk, personal risk, right? Risk to you. That means that if we are displaying courage, that we are putting ourselves at some kind of risk, right? We stand to lose something, in other words. Now, ultimately, we might stand to lose our lives. That's probably not going to happen for most of you. Some of you probably it will, right? But for most of you, you're going to stand to lose something else when you're being courageous. And most examples of courage, you're going to be standing to lose something else, maybe money, fame, a job, a friend, right? Your reputation at some kind. Maybe you stand to get hurt. Courage comes at a cost, right? So putting it all together, we have these four things. Courage is a deliberate choice to act in spite of our fear for a fundamentally good purpose involving some personal risk, right? And now we've done it. I think we can go home, right? I think we've defined courage. No, almost. We're getting there. Let me finish up here by encouraging you. Oh, come on, thanks, yeah. Encouraging you. I think to a lot of us, courage is something for other people, right? Courage is something for those people over there, right? Soldiers have courage, right? They're out on the front lines, they're fighting, they're sacrificing their lives for us and for their brothers, right? They have courage. That's for them. Or maybe, courage is for firefighters. They're running into buildings, saving people from, dying by fire, right? Those people have courage. And of course, I think those people do have courage. Tennessee football players, right, as they run across the middle of the field, knowing that safety is right there, and they stretch their body out to catch the ball anyway. That's a type of courage. Yeah, sure. So courage, I think there's this line of thinking sometimes that courage is for these people, those extra special people who are doing extra special stuff. And I think that line of thinking is very wrong. I think courage is something that God calls all of us to have and all of us to do. Because remember how we started this whole thing when we were talking about Maya Angelou, right? What was her quote? Her quote was that courage is the enabler. You can't practice all of these other virtues with any consistency unless you have courage, right? The kinds of things we want ourselves to be, kind, good, honest, just, right? We need courage to do those things with consistency. If you're kind only when it's easy to be kind, you aren't kind, right? If you're good only when it's convenient for you to be good, you're not good, right? Goodness, kindness, these things require consistency. Being good when it's hard to be good. Right. So courage enables us to face our fear, to take the personal risk that we might lose something in order to be good, right? In order to love our neighbors, even when it's really hard to love our neighbors. And trust me, you guys, I teach political science. I pay attention to American politics. I know it is hard to love your neighbors sometimes. Right? I am aware. I know that it's a very, very easy thing to say, those people over there, traitors to the country. Those people over there, they hate America, right? Those people are the enemy. Right? I know it's very, very easy to say those things. They belong to a different political party. They don't think about things the same way that I think about things. I don't have to be nice to those people, right? No. That's not what the quote said, right? That's not what the quote said. If you remember, the quote said, love one another as I have loved you. There's no qualification in there. It's not love one another as long as they're respectful. It's not love one another as long as they're, Republican. It's not love one another as long as they're like you are. It's not what it said. It just said love one another. That's much harder, right? That takes courage. It takes courage to talk to people who disagree with you. It takes courage to listen to people and hear concerns of people who maybe don't like you very much. Right? It takes courage to speak out when you see injustice, to get into good trouble. It takes courage to tell your friends that what your friends are doing isn't okay. Right? That takes courage. So go on to the next slide. To quote Albus Dumbledore, fictional wizard, it takes a great deal of courage to stand up to your enemies, but a great deal more to stand up to your friends. That might be the first time that anybody has ever quoted Albus Dumbledore in chapel, but it's true, right? Might be the first time, I'm not sure. But it's true, right? Sometimes it's hardest to have courage when that risk, remember, the courage involves risk, when that risk is that the people we like are going to be mad at us. That sometimes takes more courage than standing up to someone you already know doesn't like you, right? Sometimes that's easier because you don't have as much to lose in that scenario. Whereas when what you stand to lose is your friends, that's a lot, right? But it's true. Sometimes we need courage the most when what we're talking about is calling out our own friends, right? But that's exactly what I think we're supposed to do when we see the situation. When your friends say something racist, right? When your friends, ask that girl out over and over again even though she said no. When your friends are making fun of people in class because they're autistic or because their clothes aren't as nice or because they don't understand social cues, right? When you see people do that, when you see your friends doing that, you have to have courage. It takes courage to stand up and say, that's not okay, we can't do this. That's not who we are. We don't all have to be heroes, right? Most of us are never going to sacrifice ourselves for somebody else. Most of us are never going to give up our lives to save someone. That's okay, right? That's all right. I think there's certainly a special kind of courage for those people. But for most of us, courage is a more personal thing, right? It is about making a difference in your day-to-day lives with the people you know the best, right? It's about looking yourself in the mirror, looking at your heart, not your literal heart, don't do that, right? But it's about looking at your heart and asking yourself, do I love others like Jesus loved me? Is that what Jesus would do in this situation? Let my friends get away with doing this? Let people get away with doing this? So if we think about courage that way, I think it's something that we can all do. We can all practice this in our own lives, even if it's in small scenarios. So I'll leave you on this. The Roman playwright and philosopher Seneca had this to say about courage. Sometimes even to live is an act of courage. Sometimes even to live. And I think if Seneca were here, fortunately he's not, so he can't disagree with me. If he were here, he would think about that in the way that I've been describing, right? Sometimes just living your life and making the people in your life, think about courage or think about, doing things a little better. That takes courage. So I think my final words for you are on the next slide. Don't fight snakes, please. Don't fight snakes. Love each other and go and be courageous.